The Ed's Resolute struck the Kreth flagship at full acceleration, and the collision tore both vessels apart in a blinding explosion that lit up the darkness of space. Captain Park Hyman had stayed at the helm until the final moment, adjusting the approach angle to ensure maximum damage to the enemy command ship. Lieutenant Kang and the bridge crew had remained at their stations beside her, refusing to abandon their captain even when she ordered them to the escape pods. The tactical display on Commander Yoon's flagship showed the destruction of both ships, and for a moment the entire fleet fell silent in recognition of the sacrifice. Then the Kreth formation began to fragment as the loss of their flagship threw their command structure into chaos. Warlord Desik had been on that ship, and his death left the remaining Kreth captains without coordination or clear orders. The human fleet seized the moment and pressed their advantage, driving into the confused enemy ranks with renewed fury. Commander Yoon felt tears running down her cheeks as she gave the orders that would turn the sacrifice of the Resolute into victory. On the surface of Velith Prime, Sergeant Moon Ji-woo heard the news of the flagship's destruction through her communications unit. She paused for only a moment to honor the fallen before leading her squad toward the last remaining processing center in the city. The Kreth ground forces were receiving the same fragmentary reports from orbit, and their discipline was beginning to crack. Soldiers who had fought with cold efficiency hours ago were now looking over their shoulders and wondering if escape was possible. Ji-woo showed them no mercy and gave them no opportunity to retreat. The final processing center fell within the hour, its defenders overwhelmed by human soldiers who fought with the terrible determination of people who had already paid too high a price. Healer Varys walked through the liberated building and wept at the sight of her people emerging from the holding cells, children reunited with parents who had thought them lost forever, and survivors embraced each other with trembling arms. The human soldiers moved among them with medical supplies and ration packs, treating injuries and offering comfort in gestures that transcended the barriers of language. Varys found Sergeant Ji-woo sitting against a wall with blood soaking through her uniform from a wound. She had not bothered to mention the old healer knelt beside the human and began treating the injury with the skill she had practiced for over a century. Ji-woo tried to wave her away, insisting that she was fine and that the Velith wounded needed attention more urgently. Varys ignored her protests and continued working, telling the sergeant in broken human words that she had earned the right to be cared for in orbit. The remaining Kreth vessels were scattering in full retreat as the human fleet pressed their sudden advantage. Ships that had been hunting the Deathworlders hours ago were now fleeing toward the edge of the system, their captains desperate to escape the wrath that had consumed their fleet. Commander Yoon ordered pursuit groups to chase down the stragglers, but her primary focus remained on the planet below. The evacuation was nearly complete, with transport ships ferrying Velith civilians to safety aboard the human fleet. The ambassador stood beside the commander on the bridge and watched the tactical display show the Kreth retreat with a mixture of joy and sorrow. So many had died in the battle, both human and Velith, and the cost of victory would leave scars that might never fully heal. But her people would survive because strangers from a Deathworld had answered their call for help. She asked Commander Yoon how humanity would explain this sacrifice to their families back home. The commander was quiet for a long moment before answering in a voice heavy with the weight of command. She said that humans had been asking that question after every war in their history, and the answer was always the same: some things were worth dying for, and the protection of innocent lives was at the top of that list. The families would mourn and the nation would honor the fallen, but no one would question whether the mission had been worthwhile. 3 days later, Ambassador Talus stood before the Galactic Concord and delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations. She described the battle in detail, sparing nothing of the horror and the heroism that she had witnessed. She told them about Captain Park and Lieutenant Kang and all the others who had given their lives for people they had never met. She told them about Sergeant Jiwoo carrying wounded Velith through the burning streets, and about the medics who treated alien children with the same care they would have shown their own. The assembled delegates listened in stunned silence as the amphibian ambassador painted a picture of humanity that contradicted everything the galaxy thought it knew about Deathworld species. Healer Varys stood beside Talus and added her own testimony, describing the moment when human soldiers had burst through the doors of the processing center. She spoke of the terror she had felt when she first saw the Deathworlders, and the wonder that replaced it when they treated her with gentle compassion. The galaxy had always assumed that creatures from high-gravity worlds with toxic atmospheres would be brutal and violent by nature. Humanity had proven that the opposite could be true. Counselor Mevin Dross of the Tirani Dominion sat in his chair and could not meet the eyes of anyone in the chamber. His delegation had drafted sympathetic messages while the Velith burned, and now the weight of that choice pressed down on him like a physical burden. The Velith Collective formally requested an alliance with Earth, and humanity accepted without hesitation or conditions. Other species began approaching the human delegation with similar requests, suddenly seeing the Deathworlders in a new and unfamiliar light. Commander Yoon attended the ceremony via video transmission from her damaged flagship. Still overseeing rescue and recovery operations at Velith Prime, she accepted the thanks of the Galactic Concord with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the battle. When asked what message she wanted to send to the rest of the galaxy, she thought for a moment before speaking words that would become humanity's promise to the stars. She said that Earth would always answer when someone called for help, because that was simply what humans did. The galaxy had finally learned the truth about the Deathworld species. They were not monsters to be feared, but protectors, to be welcomed, and for those who preyed on the weak and helpless. That truth was the most terrifying thing of all. The Kreth reinforcements arrived in a wave of darkness that blotted out the stars, and Commander Yoon Sejun felt her jaw tighten as she counted the enemy vessels. Warlord Desik had called for everything available, tripling his numbers in a desperate attempt to crush the human fleet before they could liberate. The planet below the tactical displays showed a situation that any reasonable military commander would recognize as hopeless. With human forces outnumbered and outgunned on every measurable scale, Commander Yoon was not a reasonable military commander by galactic standards. She opened a channel to the fleet and gave an order that the Kreth could not possibly understand or anticipate. Hold position. The human ships did not retreat or scatter or attempt to break through the enemy lines to escape. They formed up around the damaged vessels and created a defensive perimeter that covered the drop zones where ground teams were still extracting Velith civilians. Lieutenant Kang looked at Captain Park with eyes that asked the question his voice could not speak. Wondering if command had finally lost their grip on reality, the captain met his gaze and shook her head slowly, telling him that this was exactly what they had signed up for when they volunteered. Their mission was to protect the Velith until the evacuation was complete. And that mission had not changed just because the odds had gotten worse on the surface. Sergeant Moonjiwoo led her squad through the burning streets of the capital city with fierce determination burning in her eyes. She was a small woman with short black hair and a reputation for being the most stubborn soldier in the entire ground force. The Kreth had fortified the processing centers and were defending them with heavy weapons that should have stopped any infantry assault in its tracks. Jiwoo did not care about. Should have her squad had already liberated 3 centers and freed hundreds of Velas civilians, carrying the wounded on their backs when the survivors were too weak to walk. The aliens looked at their human rescuers with expressions of disbelief and wonder, unable to comprehend why these strange creatures would risk so much for them. Hila Varys was an elderly Velith who had spent her entire life tending to the sick and injured of her community. She had witnessed the Kreth invasion from the beginning, watching helplessly as her people were dragged away to fates worse than death. When the human soldiers burst through the doors of the processing center where she had been held, she thought at first that she was dreaming. The creatures from the Deathworld fought like nothing she had ever seen, their movements fast and brutal and terrifyingly efficient. But when the battle was over and the Kreth guards lay dead on the floor, the same soldiers who had killed with such ferocity became gentle and careful as they helped the survivors to safety. Sergeant Jiwoo personally carried Varys through 3 blocks of contested streets, shielding the old healer with her own body when enemy fire came too close. The human did not speak the Veloth language, but her actions communicated everything that words could not express. In orbit, the renewed battle had become a grinding war of attrition that tested the limits of human endurance. Warlord Desic threw wave after wave of ships at the human defensive line, confident that superior numbers would eventually overwhelm the stubborn Deathworlders. Each assault cost him vessels and crews, but each assault also damaged the human ships a little more and pushed them a little closer to breaking. The Kreth commander watched the tactical display with growing frustration as hours passed and the humans still refused to retreat. Commander Yoon moved from station to station on her flagship, coordinating the defense with the calm precision that had defined her career. She knew that her fleet was dying by inches, taking damage that could not be repaired and losing crew members with every enemy assault. The ground teams reported steady progress in the evacuation, but they needed more time to reach all the processing centers and extract the remaining civilians. She looked at the numbers and calculated that they could hold for perhaps 6 more hours before their defensive line collapsed entirely. It would have to be enough. Captain Park stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched another human destroyer vanish in a flash of light as Kreth weapons found its reactor. The crew around her flinched at the loss, but nobody spoke of retreat or surrender, or any of the options that other species would have considered at this point. They had come to save the Veleth, and they would keep fighting until the mission was complete, or until there was no one left to fight. Lieutenant Kang reported that the Kreth flagship was moving into bombardment position, preparing to bypass the orbital battle entirely and destroy the human ground teams from above. The tactical officer calculated the firing solutions and realized with cold certainty that there was only one ship in position to intercept the enemy flagship before it could fire. Captain Park understood the situation without needing to hear the analysis spoken aloud. She ordered the Resolute to break formation and intercept the Kreth flagship at maximum acceleration. The assault carrier was already badly damaged, her shields failing and her hull breached in multiple sections. Commander Yoon saw the Resolute moving on the tactical display and opened a channel to demand an explanation for the unauthorized maneuver. Captain Park responded with a voice that held no fear and no regret, only the quiet certainty of someone who had made the hardest decision of their life. She said that someone had to stop the bombardment, and the Resolute was the only ship that could reach the flagship in time. The commander fell silent for a long moment before speaking 3 words that carried the weight of farewell. Good hunting. Captain Ambassador Talus stood on the bridge and watched the stars streak past as the Resolute charged toward the enemy flagship on a collision course. She asked Captain Park if there was another way. Already knowing what the answer would be, the captain shook her head and ordered the crew to prepare for evacuation. Telling them that she would handle the final approach alone, Lieutenant Kang refused to leave his station. And one by one, the other bridge officers made the same choice. They would see this through together. No matter where it ended, the Kreth flagship grew larger in the viewscreen. And Captain Park smiled with something that looked almost like peace. She had always known that she would die in the void between stars, fighting for something that mattered. She just never expected it to feel so right. Warlord Desik stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the human fleet emerge from faster-than-light travel with mild curiosity and no concern. He was a massive creature covered in thick scales and natural armor, a predator evolved to dominate every environment he encountered. The Kreth Dominion had conquered dozens of species across the galaxy, harvesting their biological resources to fuel the endless expansion of their empire. The Velith were simply the latest in a long line of prey, soft and helpless creatures whose only value lay in the chemical compounds that could be extracted from their bodies. The arrival of the human fleet was an unexpected complication, but Desik felt confident that his superior numbers would crush the intruders within hours. He had studied the reports on humanity and their Deathworld origin with the detached interest of a hunter, learning about new game. They were supposedly dangerous in close combat and possessed unusual endurance. But their ships were smaller and their weapons were weaker than Kreth military technology. The warlord ordered his outer fleet to intercept the humans while the harvesting operations continued on the surface below. He saw no reason to delay the processing of Velis civilians for the sake of swatting away a minor annoyance. Captain Park Hyman watched the Kreth formation on her tactical display and felt a cold smile spread across her face. The enemy was arranging themselves in a standard defensive screen, spreading out to cover multiple approach vectors with overlapping fields of fire. It was a textbook deployment that would work perfectly against enemies who fought according to the same tactical doctrines. Humans did not fight by the textbook. She ordered the Resolute to full combat acceleration and aimed her ship directly at the center of the Kreth formation. Lieutenant Kang confirmed the targeting solutions and reported that all weapon systems were charged and ready for sustained engagement. The other human ships followed the assault carrier in a tight formation that the Kreth sensors interpreted as a foolish concentration of forces. Warlord Desik watched the approaching humans with growing confusion as they made no attempt to spread out or maneuver around his defensive line. He ordered his captains to prepare for a simple slaughter, confident that the concentrated human fleet would be torn apart by crossfire from multiple angles. The first Kreth weapons discharged in brilliant streams of energy that should have crippled the lead human vessels and broken their foolish charge. Instead, the human ships absorbed the impacts on their forward shields and kept coming without slowing down. Desik felt the first flicker of uncertainty as he realized that the humans were not trying to outmaneuver his forces. They were driving straight through them. The EDS Resolute reached optimal weapons range and unleashed everything she carried in a devastating barrage that caught the Kreth completely off guard. Human weapons technology favored rapid-fire kinetic projectiles and focused energy beams, designed for close-range combat where their smaller ships could exploit superior maneuverability. The Kreth defensive formation that had seemed so strong moments ago suddenly became a liability as human vessels punched through the gaps and began attacking from unexpected angles. Captain Park felt the deck shudder beneath her feet as enemy fire struck the Resolute. But her ship kept pushing forward into the heart of the Kreth fleet. Lieutenant Kang called out damage reports and targeting updates in a steady voice that never wavered despite the chaos erupting around them. They were taking hits and losing systems, but they were giving far worse than they received. Warlord Desik roared orders at his captains as his carefully planned formation dissolved into scattered Chaos. The humans were not behaving like any enemy he had ever faced, refusing to retreat. When damaged and continuing to attack even when their ships were burning. He watched one human destroyer take a direct hit that should have destroyed it completely, only to see the crippled vessel ram a Kreth cruiser and detonate its reactor in a final act of defiance. These creatures fought like they had already accepted death, and were determined to drag as many enemies with them as possible on the surface of Velith Prime. The harvesting operations continued, even as the battle raged in orbit above medic specialist Cha Yunji, crouched in the wreckage of a drop pod, and helped a wounded Velith child drink water from her canteen. The amphibian girl was barely conscious, her gills damaged by the toxic smoke that filled the air of the occupied city. Yunji had trained for combat medicine on a dozen different worlds, but nothing had prepared her for the systematic horror that the Kreth had inflicted on these gentle people processing centers stood in the ruins of what had once been schools and hospitals, their walls stained with evidence of the atrocities committed inside. The ground team had dropped through the orbital battle to establish a foothold in the capital city, fighting their way through Kreth soldiers to reach the civilian population. They were outnumbered and surrounded and running low on ammunition. But none of them considered retreat as an option. The Velith survivors they found were traumatized and terrified, many of them injured from their attempts to escape the harvesting patrols. Yunji treated their wounds with gentle hands and soft words, promising them that help had arrived and that the nightmare would soon be over. She did not know if that promise was true, but she knew that hope was sometimes the only medicine that could save a person. In orbit, the tide of battle was turning. In ways that defied all logical analysis, the Kreth outer fleet had been shattered, their formation broken by the relentless human assault that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. Warlord Desik stared at the tactical display and could not understand how his superior forces were being driven back by enemies who should have been easy prey. He had expected the humans to break and run when they realized they were outmatched, as every other species would have done in their position. Instead, they fought harder with every ship they lost, each death seeming to fuel their determination rather than diminish it. Ambassador Talus watched the battle from the bridge of the Resolute and wept tears of joy and terror as she witnessed the impossible unfolding before her eyes. The Deathworld species was doing exactly what they had promised, fighting and bleeding and dying to save people they had never met. Captain Park stood at the center of the chaos with blood running down her face from a cut on her forehead, calling orders with the calm voice of someone who had already made peace. With whatever outcome awaited her, the Kreth outer fleet was broken, but Warlord Desik was calling for reinforcements from the homeworld. More enemy ships would arrive within hours, and the human fleet was already damaged and exhausted from the first engagement. Captain Park looked at the ambassador and spoke, words that carried the weight of absolute commitment. She said that they would hold the line until every Velith was safe, no matter what it cost them. Talus believed her. The assembly point near the Helix Nebula had never seen so many human warships gathered in one place, and the sight made Ambassador Talus tremble with emotions. She could not name. Hundreds of vessels hung in the darkness of space, their running lights blinking like stars that had descended from the heavens to wage war on behalf of her dying people. Captain Park Hymin stood on the bridge of the ED's Resolute and watched the final ships arrive with quiet satisfaction in her dark eyes. The assault carrier was the largest vessel in the human fleet, a massive construct of metal and fury that carried enough firepower to level a small moon. She had served aboard the Predator Resolute for 12 years, climbing through the ranks with determination and skill until the day she finally took command. Now she would lead her ship and her crew into battle against an enemy that outnumbered them and outgunned them. And she felt nothing but calm resolve. Lieutenant Kang Do-yun stood at the tactical station and reviewed the intelligence reports with growing concern about what they would face when they arrived at Velith. Prime, the Kreth Dominion, had committed a significant portion of their combat fleet to the harvesting operation, confident that no one would challenge their claim to the amphibian species. Their ships were larger than human vessels and carried heavier weapons, designed for overwhelming force rather than tactical flexibility. The young lieutenant calculated the odds and found them unfavorable. But he kept his doubts to himself because he knew that numbers alone did not determine the outcome of battles. Commander Yoon called a fleet-wide briefing and addressed every ship through the communications network with the calm authority that had defined her career. She explained the situation in clear terms, describing the Kreth presence and their harvesting operations without softening the reality of what they would face. The enemy was strong and ruthless and had no regard for the lives they were destroying. And the human fleet would be fighting far from home with no reinforcements available. She paused and looked directly into the camera, her eyes meeting the gaze of every soldier and sailor who had volunteered for this mission. Then she asked if anyone wanted to turn back. And the silence that answered her question said everything that needed to be said. Ambassador Talus attended the briefing from the observation deck of the Resolute, watching the human commander with fascination and wonder. The amphibian diplomat had spent her entire career studying other species and learning their customs and motivations. But humans remained a mystery that she could not solve. Every other species in the galaxy operated on principles of self-interest and calculated advantage, forming alliances and breaking them based on what they could gain. Humans seemed to operate on different rules entirely, driven by concepts that Talus struggled to translate into terms that made sense to her people. She approached Captain Park after the briefing and asked for permission to observe the combat operations from the bridge. The captain studied her with measuring eyes and then nodded, telling the ambassador that she was welcome to witness what humanity could do when they set their minds to something. Talus thanked her and asked another question that had been troubling her since she first boarded the human transport. She wanted to know how the soldiers could remain so calm when they were sailing toward a battle that might kill them all. Captain Park smiled with an expression that mixed warmth and steel in equal measure, and her answer revealed something fundamental about the human spirit. She said that fear was natural and that every person in the fleet felt it coursing through their veins like ice water. But humans had learned long ago that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. The soldiers preparing for battle in the corridors and hangars of the Resolute were afraid, but they had chosen to act anyway because innocent lives depended on their willingness to fight. Talus felt the weight of that statement settle into her bones as she watched the crew go about their duties with focused determination. Lieutenant Kang approached the captain with updated sensor readings that showed the fleet was ready for the jump to Velith Prime. Every ship had reported in and confirmed their battle readiness, and the moment of truth was approaching. Faster than anyone had anticipated, Captain Park ordered the fleet to prepare for faster-than-light travel and sent a final message to Commander Yoon confirming that the Resolute would lead the vanguard assault. The commander acknowledged the message and reminded the captain that the primary objective was the protection of Velith civilians above all other considerations. They were not coming to win glory or claim territory, but to save lives. And every tactical decision should reflect that fundamental priority. The fleet jumped as one. Hundreds of ships vanishing from the assembly point in flashes of light that illuminated the nebula like a storm of fallen stars. Ambassador Talus gripped the railing of the observation deck as reality twisted around her, the strange sensations of faster-than-light travel making her stomachs churn. She thought about her homeworld and the people she had left behind, wondering how many had survived the 3 days since her departure. The reports that had reached the Galactic Concord painted a grim picture of systematic harvesting and brutal efficiency, with Creth soldiers sweeping through cities and dragging civilians to the processing ships. Her people were pacifists who had never developed weapons or military tactics, trusting in the civilized nature of the galaxy to protect them from predators. That trust had proven to be a fatal mistake. And now the only hope for the Velith Collective rested in the hands of a Deathworld species that the galaxy had always feared. Captain Park noticed the ambassador's distress and walked over to stand beside her at the observation window. She did not offer empty comfort or false promises about the outcome of the coming battle, but instead shared a simple truth that Talus would carry with her forever. The captain said that humans understood loss and suffering because their own history was written in blood and tears, and the ashes of countless tragedies. They knew what it meant to face extinction and to fight against impossible odds with nothing but stubborn refusal to accept defeat. That experience had shaped them into something that the galaxy had never seen before. A species that would cross the stars to help strangers because they remembered what it felt like to stand alone. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Velith system, and the first sensor readings confirmed their worst fears. Creth warships filled the space around the homeworld like a swarm of hungry predators, their harvesting vessels descending to the surface in a constant stream. Commander Yoon opened a channel to the entire fleet and spoke 5 words that would echo through human military history for generations to come. She simply said that it was time to work. That battle for Velith Prime had begun. The distress signal cut through the void of space like a scream in the darkness, and every species within range of the galactic communications hub heard it clearly. Ambassador Talus pressed her webbed hands against the transmission console as her voice broke with desperation, begging anyone who could hear to send help before it was too late for her people. The Velith homeworld was burning, and the amphibian species had no weapons to defend themselves against the monsters that had come to harvest them. Like cattle on Station Villa 9, the neutral diplomatic outpost that served as the heart of Galactic Concord communications, representatives from dozens of species listened to the signal with varying degrees of interest and concern. Counselor Mevan Dross of the Tirani Dominion leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh that conveyed nothing but bored indifference to the suffering being. Described the Velith were a peaceful species known throughout the galaxy for their medical advancements and their gentle nature, but they possessed no strategic value to the greater powers of the Concord. They had no rare minerals beneath their oceans, no military strength to offer as allies, and no political leverage to demand intervention on their behalf. The Creth Dominion had chosen their target well, selecting a species that nobody would fight to protect. Counselor Dross turned to his aide and began drafting a response that expressed deep sympathy for the Velith situation while committing absolutely nothing in terms of actual assistance. Other delegations did the same, crafting carefully worded messages that would allow them to claim moral standing without risking a single ship or soldier. The bureaucratic machinery of the Galactic Concord ground forward with its usual efficiency, processing the extinction of a species as just another item on the daily agenda. Ambassador Talus watched the responses arrive one by one, and each message of hollow sympathy drove another spike of despair into her hearts. She had fled her homeworld 3 days ago at the insistence of her government, carrying the desperate hope that someone in the wider galaxy would answer their call for salvation. The Creth had arrived without warning, their massive harvesting ships descending through the clouds like dark omens of death. And within hours, they had established complete orbital control Her people were being taken from their homes and loaded into processing vessels, their bodies destined to be broken down for biological resources that the Kreth valued more than Velith lives. Talis had sent her distress signal to every frequency she could reach, casting her plea into the void and praying that someone would care enough to respond. The major powers had answered with words, empty and meaningless words that would not stop a single Kreth soldier from dragging another Velith child into a harvesting pod. She was beginning to accept that her species would die, alone and forgotten, when the human transmission arrived. The message was brief, and unlike anything else that had come through the communications hub that day, there were no expressions of sympathy, no carefully crafted diplomatic language designed to avoid commitment, and no promises to discuss the matter in future council sessions. The transmission from Earth contained only 2 words that made Counselor Dross drop his drink in shock. Fleet. Mobilizing Commander Yoon Seojin stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Coalition flagship and watched her officers execute the deployment orders with practiced efficiency. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles to count, and she had made her decision within seconds of hearing the Velith distress signal. The bureaucrats back on Earth would catch up eventually, rubber-stamping the authorization that she had already given, because they knew better than to stand in the way when humanity decided to act across the solar system. Ships were breaking orbit and setting course for the assembly point near the Helix Nebula cruisers and destroyers and assault carriers all answered the call, their crews volunteering so quickly that commanding officers had to turn people away. The news networks back home were already running the story, showing images of the Velith and their peaceful underwater cities. And humanity responded the way it always did when innocents suffered. They got angry. And then they got moving. Commander Yoon had served in the fleet for 37 years, and she had never once regretted her choice to wear the uniform. She had fought pirates and defended colonies and stood against every threat that dared to challenge human territory. But this mission felt different somehow. The Velith had no treaty with Earth, no trade agreements, and no political connections that would obligate humanity to intervene on their behalf. They were strangers on the other side of the galaxy, a species that most humans had never heard of before today. And yet the volunteers kept coming faster than the fleet could process them. Her communications officer turned from his station with a puzzled expression and reported that the Galactic Concord was demanding an explanation for the sudden military mobilization. Commander Yoon smiled without humor and told him to send a simple response. Earth received the SOS, and Earth was answering on Station Velar 9. The alien delegations watched the human fleet reports with growing confusion and disbelief. Counselor Dross demanded to know what treaty obligation compelled the humans to act, certain that there must be some hidden agreement or secret alliance that explained this madness. His aides searched the diplomatic records and found nothing. No connection between Earth and the Velith Collective that would justify the deployment of a full combat fleet. The humans were mobilizing for war against a superior enemy to defend a species they had never met. And nobody could understand why Ambassador Talis received permission to board a human transport vessel that would carry her to the assembly point. And she spent the journey in a state of stunned disbelief. The soldiers around her prepared their weapons and checked their equipment with calm professionalism, treating the upcoming battle as just another mission to complete. She asked one young Marine why he had volunteered for an operation that might cost him his life for the sake of aliens he had never seen. Marine looked at her with genuine confusion, as if the question made no sense to him, and then he shrugged and gave her an answer that she would never forget. Someone was in trouble and asked for help. So, of course, Talis felt tears running down her scaled cheeks as she finally understood what made the Deathworld species so terrifying to the rest of the galaxy. It was not their strength or their endurance, or their capacity for violence that set them apart from other beings. It was their stubborn and irrational refusal to abandon anyone who called out for salvation. Even when the smart choice was to look away and protect themselves, the human fleet jumped to faster than light travel. And Ambassador Talus found herself hoping for the first time since the Creth had arrived. Commander Yoon stood beside her on the observation deck as the stars stretched into lines of light around them. And Talus asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Since she first heard the human response, why did Earth answer when nobody else? Would the commander looked at her with eyes that held both sorrow and iron determination? And her response was simple enough that even a child could understand it, because you asked.